Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murderer. With me today, as always, is the panel, and in a very particular order, we'll start from the top. Say, hey, Big Jeff, how you doing?
Hey, Jeff, I'm doing great. It's good to be back. With our new recording schedule, I miss being around my friends, especially Jack and Tony, because in the off times, I only have my friends Jack and Coke to keep me company. So it's good to be back with you all.
That's fantastic, yeah. And you don't want to be around your friends Jack and Coke too much. Whereas,
Not too much.
Dr. Silkman and Jack, you can take probably more of them. Absolutely. Well, Dr. Silkman, how's it going down under there today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you, Jeff, and a big hello to all the panel and everyone in chat. It's really, really good to be here. Fantastic.
And Kelly.
Good morning, panel. Good morning, everybody, and it's good to be back. That's all I got.
All right, Jack, how you doing?
Well, I mean, Jack and Coke that's a hard act to follow there, Big Jeff. That's a favorite.
Oh yes,
Absolutely. But yep. Hello, panel, and hello everyone in live chat. Good to be back for another session. Getting a little deeper into MAM 2. So maybe we can finish up episode 1 today. I'm kidding.
Calm down, Jack. Well, as far as we get is as far as we get, and that's our motto, and that's what we're sticking to. So, without any further ado,
Where was the cut on the inside?
It's right here on the first joint. It's right there.
Okay, let's just do this.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, perfect. And we could have him open the car up. And let's just see if there's any blood when you do that. I don't know if we can see it too. It's probably underneath, right?
Oh, here, what if I do this?
Yeah, up under the, hard to see it. If you can just pick the key up. So you're right-handed, so you're gonna have it in your right hand. So let's see if there'd be any way you'd make that smear. Yeah, you didn't even touch it. Let's see if you touch the gear shift. Yeah, he's not going to move it, but he left a big smear right there. Do you see it? Why don't we try it again with a little bit more blood? So again, you don't come anywhere near that spot. Yeah, see on the, yeah, look at it on the side of the wheel. Oh, look, it's on here on the ring now. See the silver?
Yeah.
This is something that everyone can actually do. That was one of the first things I did when I grabbed my blood vial and I took it outside and I got into the car. I actually didn't do the paper like Kathleen did, but I put the blood on my finger and I constantly try to turn the key over and over again. I flicked my hand in other ways. I try to smear it. No matter how many times I tried, there is no way that my fingers touch that dashboard. And the beautiful thing is, like I said, anyone can do it. Anyone can go to their car right now and try it. And I don't think it would matter what car you have. Cars are designed for you not to be touching that dashboard. So I just wanted to highlight that it's such a simple test, but a very effective one. And it's not hard to see that no matter how you try to construct it, no matter how many times you try to reenactment, you're going to all get the same outcome, and that's the fact that the state's narrative that he turned the key and he touched it while he was turning the key it's impossible.
but didn't Mr. Kratz say that the stain that he left was exactly commensurate with how you have to move your hand to turn the key? I thought that's what he said.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you telling me he's lying?
I'd hate to break it to you, to Big Jeff, but he's lying.
I think, thank you very much, Kelly. Your blood experiments that you did really, really illuminating. But it also goes to show how ridiculous the entire state scenario was. And that's why, in my opinion, it would have been really handy if Stephen Avery's defense team had a blood spatter expert. And what we can actually see here is that Kathleen Zellner is taking her time in order to try and reproduce what we see in the RAV4, right? And as you can elegantly see, it's impossible to reproduce what you see there. And isn't it interesting that as she was applying blood, just the natural action of you starting a car, touching the gear lever shift, touching the steering wheel, that's exactly where we don't find the blood in the Toyota RAV4. However, it looks awfully suspicious like Stephen's Pontiac Grand Am, right? The distribution of the blood in the Pontiac Grand Am is exactly what you would expect to see for someone who's actively bleeding. Blood on the gear shift, blood on the central console. You have a look at the Toyota RAV4. You don't find that. And in my opinion, that's actually quite telling.
About the Grand Dam. So let's address that because I see a lot of, it's not conflict, but just a lot of, you know, different angles on here. When we see it on the gear shift, what is the actual narrative to where the blood came from in the Grand Dam? Was it when he first cut open his finger and then drove it around? Or are we going through the fact that he says that when Stephen says that when he reopened his cut on the 3rd, he went into the Grand Dam to grab his phone charger and he was dripping and stuff. The reason why I asked that is because I had the conflicts, again, not the right word, but the arguments that I see from both sides is the guilters have said, you guys are all hypocrites. You sit there and say that, there should be blood on the gear shift and there should be the blood on the steering wheel, but the state in one of their 7 bloody changing stories that they gave this blood pattern, Stephen didn't drive the car, so you wouldn't expect it on there. Yet we have the Grand Dam, which has got blood on the gear shift, but Stephen never says that he bled on the gear shift because he was driving it. It was stationary, and he grabbed the phone charger out and smeared as he was doing it. So I just thought we should maybe address that bit because, again, there's blood on the gear shift, but is that from the first time he cut his finger open and he was driving around, or is it from it being stationary and it's a contact smear from where he was getting his phone charger out? Therefore, the pattern again is different again because it's not matching all the narratives that everyone keeps throwing in there, that where the blood come from, where it should be, where it shouldn't be.
Well, I mean, we know that he recut open his hand or his finger on November the 3rd, right? Because he said that he was over at his sister's trailer and moved something and he recut it open again. And Stephen stated that he did go in his Pontiac Grand Am. So how do you explain the blood on the gear shift lever? He simply could have leant into the car and you know how you go into your vehicle and you touch something to get some balance, especially if you're reaching out to grab the charger, depending on where the phone charger was. If he had rested his hand on the gear lever shift, then you would have seen blood being dripped. And you're right, it's like a contact stain. If you're going to drive a vehicle like the Toyota RAV4, because remember what the state said was that Stephen and Brendan had backed up Teresa's Toyota RAV4 in the garage, right? Which implies that they drove the vehicle. The fact that the vehicle was present in the pit area meant that either Stephen or Brendan had to have driven that vehicle to that location. If you're driving the vehicle, absolutely everyone knows you're going to touch the handbrake, you're going to touch the gear lever shift, you're definitely going to touch the steering wheel. You don't find any of his blood on those locations. This is important, guys, because now this forced Kratz to change the narrative. He knew that it didn't fit the narrative of someone bleeding and driving the vehicle. So Ken Kratz changed the narrative to say, oh, well, maybe Stephen bled after he dropped off the car at the pit. So you know that he's now paying attention to what Kathleen Zellner is doing and demonstrating because it doesn't fit the narrative. So now Stephen has cut his finger open or reopen again, not while driving the RAV4, not while attacking Teresa RAV4, Teresa, but after he parked the vehicle at the pit because he's got no answer.
Here's the thing, and I talked about a lot of my interest in this case, both cases, is the mechanically how did they put it together, and say mechanically you think about working on a car, but I'm talking about how they piece these narratives together, and this whole deal about the RAV and the blood. I think about cutting myself working on cars in the past and being inside and being under the hood and not knowing that I'm bleeding, number one. Don't have any photos of that, but I think about the key and it having that fabric fob, no blood on it that we are aware of. I'm not sure that Sherry ever tested the fob. I don't think, or the cloth pot or whatever that material is. That's number one. Number two, and you guys have covered it really well, I won't rehash it. Where should the blood have been dripping from that finger, that reopened cut on Stephen's finger? I don't know. To me, though, it's not in places that I would suspect it should have been. That's just me, just looking, again, mechanically. The reasonable man, as Big Jeff says, or the reasonable woman, where's this stuff going to fall at as you're moving around? It's dripping. Where the fuck's it going to fall? The last thing I'll say, the Grand Am, a lot of good questions there and comments, but I think that, if you look inside of it, the stains are really a lot different than they are inside the RAV. They really are. And I'm not saying that they necessarily wouldn't be, because he was in that car clearly many times from the time he sliced it open and then reopened it again. So that's not shocking to me. But where these stains are is a little. To me, it tells a truer picture versus the RAV4. This is strictly, again, putting the story together. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you, Jack. It kind of leads into the comment I wanted to make. Like, they just demonstrated that blood would have ended up on the shift column, on the shift there, the shifter. And so what are we to believe? There's no blood there. Did Stephen wipe that down? Brendan and Stephen wiped that down, but then forgot to get the part by the ignition? Forgot to check the other important parts? It doesn't fit together. It doesn't fit the narrative that I was going to that you guys have just brought up. I just wanted to spin one question, and that is, do open cuts tend to bleed this like as much as the original cut? Because in my experience, they don't. You have a cut and it's Kel.
Yes, good question. So this is actually one of the biggest things that I did when I started the experiment. When I sat down with the 3 consultants and we sat down, we pulled up the hand anatomy, and I actually do have a picture of something that we used. I was using it as a guideline when I was doing my experiments, and it was one of the things we focused on. It was one of the factors we had to consider. And that was the one thing that we all spoke about. We said, okay, this isn't a freshly cut wound. This isn't going through the, what is in that part of the finger. Is it, obviously there's veins, but is it enough to create, pools of blood? Like what's going to be the outcome of it? So basically, when you first cut yourself open, you can expose tissues, veins, all various little microscopic little vessels, and everything is exposed, and your heart is pumping, so everything bleeds flowingly, and it's fresh, so it's got one place it goes is obviously out until it stops bleeding. I know Dr. Silkman and I have addressed this a few times, but whenever you cut yourself, our bodies automatically send in basic cells and factors to go in there and stop and automatically start coagulation. If we didn't have coagulation factors in our own blood, you would bleed out from a paper cut. So we when we were looking at it, me and Dr. JJ, he was one of the leading guys that actually was the one that has watched Making a Murderer. He said to me, when someone recuts open a wound, going off what we would expect to see of Stevens, it would have been already like scab-like. Majority of the time, all they do is when you reopen a wound is you hit off the top of the scab wound, and you're taking off the first or second layer of that wound. Then he went on to say that the fibers, the really underneath fibers, have already started to heal, or at that stage have healed, and therefore you wouldn't get the flow as you would if it was like a fresh cut. So when I said it drips, he goes, that would make more sense. You would expect more of a dripping sensation than a pouring sensation, because we don't know how healed it was. We don't know what layer of his finger had already, the fibers underneath had already layered, had already healed, and we don't know whether it knocked it off. And then when we went through some of the reports and we kept seeing the flake report, he said that's why Ken Kratz was probably cheeky and was trying to allude to the point that that was probably the scab of the flake, and that all he had done was knocked off that. He said, as much as he laughed and said, no, there's a difference between flakes and scabs, and it's completely different. But he said that's probably what he's done. When you also cut open your reopen a wound, and like I said to you, we've got the foundation of where it's already started to heal. You have crustation as well, so the flow of the pattern could change. If you've got like an area that you didn't reopen and it's already healed, it changes the pattern of the flow. For all we know, it could have been the shorter end of the wound that he reopened, and then it was protected by the crustaceans of what was still there. So again, it will change the flow of how it will run down. It changes the way it's controlled in terms of how it's impacted into the finger. And again, it really comes down to the fibers, how deep it was to the original cut, and how far through it was in development of healing when he recut it open. But overall, the verdict we kind of came up with was, no, you will not bleed as much on your reopen than you would in your original. However, there's so many variables to that. Again, where you were cut, how deep it was. There's so many factors, but going off the finger and that area of the finger definitely would have been in his overall theory, thoughts was drips. You would get drips. And here's the thing that JJ and I, and actually the other two, Dr. Susan Sharp and stuff, kind of discussed as well. When I bring up the coagulation stage, when you cut yourself, your body would automatically go into like a frenzy of sending in all the bits and bops to go, stop bleeding, help, help, help. Things can alter that. We have drugs. If you're on certain drugs, especially blood thinners, it's a lot harder to control. When I obviously did this research, I looked to see what drugs or medication Stephen was on. He was on something, but after reviewing, it did not alter his blood. It was more of a heart control and blood pressure, but not a blood thinner. And again, I can't be confident that he was taking it at that time, or whether it was more something that he was taking after being released from jail or in jail, and it just came home with him. And yeah, the thing is, when Stevens gives us his narrative of dripping, I know this is going to go a little bit beyond where we're going at this moment. We could maybe save it a little bit later for the sync, but when you cut open your finger, your body's automatically sending in those signs to start the coagulation to stop. So you have to follow the pattern of, by the time he got to his grand dam, what point would he have been in terms of the bleeding? So if we follow his original narrative, it's he goes, he unhinges, he recuts open, bang. Everyone agreed that that's usually the first point of contact that you'd expect majority of the blood to fall, is when you first recut it open. Then in his narrative, he goes over to his grand dam and then he pulls the phone charger. That is a second point, and you would expect to probably see majority of the drips there, because by this stage the body's just been reopened, your heart's pumping, he's walking around, so he's added extra pressure to his body, so the heart's pumping a little bit faster, more's coming out, but again, it'd be more of a drip versus a pour. And then he claims that this is hard, the original, he goes straight into the back of his trailer, into the bathroom, drip, 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 and then leaves. Later on in 2017 to 2018, and he does his supplemental affidavit, he changes the narrative where it goes from, obviously, reopens his finger, always maintains his second point was the grand dam. Then he puts himself at the doorway of Barb's residence, and where Bobby's watching him drip, drip, drip. Then he goes into his bathroom and drip, drip, drip. The only issue that the doctors came with that one is the fact that if this is over even if it's the first 5 minutes that he gets to his bathroom, your natural body should have already slowed down. The coagulation stage would have already set into place. Yes, you could still be freely dripping because you're moving your finger around, you're not applying pressure, you've done nothing to maintain the flow or the drip, but you wouldn't be expecting it to be as big as it was when it first happened. So these are all the factors that when I did all my experiments, I had to factor in everything. And I will send you the picture of that I worked off. And if you can insert it here so everyone can see, this is what me and the doctors were working off. So you guys can see that when we were in the experiment construction, this is what we used.
Just a brief comment, and I promise. But just based on everything, Kel's experiences, talking to Doc and Big Jeff. Oh, by the way, Cal, the Dr. JJ, that's a really awesome name. And I don't know if I've told you guys this before, but my middle name is Jefferson, and I'm not kidding. I can prove that. So you got 3 Jeffs on this panel really to deal with, plus a Dr. JJ. Anyway, here's the thing about that key. Unless Stephen was carrying those keys around with tongs or tweezers or pliers, how could he have not gotten some blood on the key and or that fabric part of that fob? That's all I'm saying. Because he would have had it in his hand, and that's just the natural way you would hold a key with that fob. Don't get it.
100% correct. And just going over some of the points that Kelly made, she's 100% correct, of course, because as part of the healing process, what normally happens underneath your skin, you've got all these cells and factors that form a plug. The important thing is that when you cut yourself, Kelly's correct, you have all these factors that occur, biochemical factors that occur in your bloodstream very, very quickly. The other important thing is that you attract platelets. And platelets help to form a plug in order to prevent you from bleeding out. Now, people like hemophiliacs, and Kelly will back me up, they don't have all the appropriate clotting factors, which means that if you cut yourself, even a minor cut, potentially you can bleed out, right? So the normal physiological response is to form a plug at the site where you have cut. Otherwise, you're going to heavily bleed. Now, you're going to bleed the most on a de novo cut. The very first time that you cut yourself, obviously your body hasn't responded yet and is in the process of responding. So when you cut yourself for the very first time, you're going to bleed potentially quite profusely. This is a wound that Stephen has had for quite a long period of time. And I remember reading a document in which Roland Johnson, the actual owner of Stephen's trailer, said, yeah. He remembered seeing that very same wound a long, long time ago. In other words, before Teresa Hallbach ever went on the premises on October the 31st. So this is an old wound. So the state's narrative is that Stephen recut open that particular wound, because that's really the only major wound that he's got on his finger. He reopened that wound on October the 31st, bled in the RAV4, the wound healed, and then on November the 3rd, which is when he went to Menards with his brother Chuck, he then reopened that wound again. So in other words, it's the one wound that keeps on being reopened all the time. And I just want to make one final point. Well, actually two, in terms of what Stephen's narrative was about going to Barb's trailer and Bobby Dassey could have seen him bleeding. The other flip side of this is that after Stephen had bled, he could have easily gone to his trailer, put on the tape around his finger, and then gone to Barb's trailer to say, hey, look, boys, we're going to Menards. Is anyone interested in coming along? So potentially the boys like Bobby Dassey, Blaine, or whoever was there could have seen that he had injured himself. That is a possibility. And my final point is this. Brendan Dassey was asked by Fassbender and Uyghur about Stephen's injury to his finger. And they asked him, was he bleeding? And Brendan Dassey gave 7 different versions of how Stephen had recut open his wound on October the 31st. 7 different versions. To me, guys, it indicates that Brendan had no idea how Stephen had recut open his wound, right?
Not a clue.
So,
Not a clue.
So take that into account. There's nothing consistent with what Brendan said, and I think that's actually quite telling. And Jack is 100% correct. If you're holding in a key, you think about it. You're holding the key in your right hand to put it into the ignition. You've got the very finger that is bleeding on the key, which tends to indicate that you would expect some type of blood, even a small amount of blood, either on the key itself or on the fob. The fob is very absorbent. Now, we know that Cherie Cohane said she noted no blood and, in fact, did not do a presumptive test to test for blood, which means that visually she saw no blood on that key and also on the fob. Thank you.
Okay.
That's not surprising.
Yeah. The blood is all over on the silver and on the key itself. Yeah, look, it's over. Look, if you hold the light for a minute, see where the, right in there. I mean, these are all places where they found no blood, you know. The other thing we could do, there's a release latch over on the right, and then I'll show you how to open the hood. Now we do right hand on the prop. Yeah. Stuart is really amazing.
Sorry?
Look at that.
There's also some on the metal
Look at that
latch
big
right
blob
here.
of blood.
Yep.
Yeah, the prosecution presented testimony that when Stephen turned the ignition key, that the cut on the first joint of his middle finger had made the blood pattern stain by the ignition, and that he'd done that just naturally as part of turning the key. Well, that's ludicrous, because once you get in the car and you put the ignition key in and you turn it, you're 2 inches from that stain. That is not how it happened. I don't care. You could get in that car and do that 1,000 times with blood on your finger, and you will never create that mark. So what does that tell me? Once I uncover one lie like that, I know there's a whole bunch more lying going on, because no legitimate, honest prosecution would ever resort to that. So when Kratz says in the closing, no, it doesn't matter if the key was planted, we've got so much else. Oh yeah, it matters, because the whole case can collapse on one piece of evidence. But once I saw that, I thought, all of this blood testimony is just a complete lie.
What Kathleen Zellner and her experts tried to do is reproduce the crime scene. And Kelly, through her excellent work that she's done over a long period of time, tried to do exactly the same thing. Try to reproduce the blood pattern that you see in that vehicle. And Kelly has done experiments with fresh blood from purple top tubes, etc., to try and reproduce the crime scene. I think this was a big opportunity. I don't know what everybody else on the panel and chat thinks. I think this was a big missed opportunity by Stephen's defense team. As you can see here, neither Strang or Buting got somebody in to try and reproduce what we see in the RAV. Kathleen Zellner has tried to reproduce what we see in the RAV, and as we'll see in a minute, it's actually quite easy to do with a stopper, and it doesn't take very long in order to do it. What she cannot reproduce is someone who's actively bleeding from a finger and leaving that type of blood stain pattern inside the RAV4. In my opinion, that's very, very powerful. And the state, because remember, Jack, we went through Ken Kratz's book, page by page. We took a year to do it. And as you can see, Ken Kratz has to keep on backpedaling, right? He has no answer. He can't explain the blood distribution pattern. So he's got to come up with all these weird and wonderful excuses to say, oh, well, there was no blood on the key. And a lot of the guilt to say, oh, that's because Stephen wiped the key. Well, if he wiped the key, why would he bother wiping the key and then leaving his own DNA on the key, which is so convenient for Cherie Cohen to pick up? It doesn't make any sense.
I'm reminded, Duck, of an interview that Kratz had, I think it was with an ABC reporter, and the ABC reporter asked him about, or were there any fingerprints that Stephen Avery found, or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing. And Kratz's reply was, well, I don't have the case file in front of me. I can't answer that. Well, that son of a bitch knew that they didn't find any fingerprints of Stephen on that RAV. He knew that. So he had to run from it, as you said, backpedaling.
Yeah, and 100% correct, Jack. And it really looks stupid and really, really bad. If you have to keep on finding excuses, the best excuse ever was when Wiegert said they had 5 days to clean up. I nearly destroyed my iPad and television, right? So, it's not fair that the prosecuting team keep on using the excuse they cleaned up, because they can't explain the forensics. And if they have to rely on they cleaned it up, then quite clearly Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey did not do a good job at cleaning anything, because Stephen had left his own incriminating blood inside the victim's vehicle on the salvage yard, right? And left the key with his own DNA in his own bedroom. So he and also Brendan were meticulously able to expunge all evidence of any crime taking place inside his trailer and his garage. And remember, guys, how brutal this crime was. We're talking about a dismemberment here, guys. You're not going to get anything worse than that. and yet he was able to expunge Teresa Halbach from his trailer and garage, and yet was dumb enough to leave his own blood in the RAV4, and also the fact that he touched the hood latch as well. I don't know about you guys, but it doesn't make any sense.
Would you look at the next exhibit, identify it, please?
Exhibit 299. This is the rear door of the RAV4. This is the interior panel of that door.
And did you observe any bloodstain patterns on the interior panel of the rear cargo door area?
Yes, I did.
Please describe those for the jurors.
You can see here, these are impact stains. They're circular or near circular. And then some of these stains have a flow pattern.
Were you able to determine how those would be deposited? The ones that you observed, the impact stains with the flow pattern?
These stains, or this blood was appeared to have been flung off or released from a bloody object.
Would that be consistent with a body with bloody hair being put into the back of this vehicle?
Yes, it would. And in this particular case, these stains don't necessarily require the bloody hair component. However, it is consistent with a bloody object such as a body being loaded into the rear end of this vehicle.
Notice he said that it didn't need the bloody hair component, which is really interesting because didn't the state allude that Stephen had in actual fact shot Teresa Halbach twice in the head and a total of 10 or 11 times? So hence the only source of blood that one could imagine that would have come from, that's the blood that hit the back cargo door, would have been from Teresa's head, right? So this is a watershed moment in the case, because what the state were trying to do here is to prove that both Stephen and Brendan picked Teresa Halbach up after she was extensively bleeding on the head and flung her into the back of her own RAV4, right? This is a crucial moment in the case. Unfortunately, Strang and Buting could not counteract this argument. This was a fatal blow, in my opinion.
If you have a bloody object or a person that's being flung parallel to that door, and in this case, from outside to inside the cargo door, then the shape of the stain is going to reflect that, meaning that for the horizontal motion of the blood that has been projected as the result of cast off is going to create more angular stains that would look more similar to these more elongated stains here.
Okay, so on your example there, just so I understand this, if the body were flung into the back of the trunk, show me which stain I would expect to see if the blood came directly off the body. What would I be seeing on the rear cargo door?
You would be seeing stains that are more elongated with the tail of the stain pointing in that direction of.
Do you think if this testimony was presented in trial back in 2007, do you think this would have been beneficial or would have made no difference to Stephen Avery?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I was literally trying to find the right moment to do the exact same thing. Yeah, I think this is what should have happened, purely because of the same reason. This is what I find really interesting. Kathleen's expert here is one of the greatest splatter experts. Okay, so we're all aware of that. Yet we just watched the state's witness go up there and talk absolute shit. So it's just, I think it's really funny how, well, it's not even funny, it's quite sad that as much as everyone relies on the experts, it just goes to show that you pay an expert for the answer that you want. And this is why I have problems with sometimes experts, because you can have the same evidence, the same narrative, the same everything, but just two different opinions from whoever on both sides, because it's whoever's paying for the answer that they want. And I think that's dangerous, because in this Stephen Avery case, the jury only ever got the state's side. They always got the taste of the state side, and it was always left with the state side, because there was no one over there to balance it out and go, hang on a minute, no, this is another alternative that could have happened. All you have to do is raise reasonable doubt that, and for experts, and we learned this in, I'm going to say it, the Johnny Depp case, there's got to be some kind of, you're selling the verdict as well. You're selling what you're putting out there. And if you're not likable, they won't believe a fucking word you say. And you could be right. You could be the expert that's right. But if you're not relatable, if you're not expressing it properly, if you're not elaborating it correctly, simplifying it for them to follow along, you've lost them. And you could be the expert that has the most highest expertise. You might be the one that has the most credentials and the most qualified and right, but you can lose the jury if your persona is not being taken in. So yeah, I think for your answer that you asked and posed of your question, yes, this is what should have happened. It's not even a question. It should have just been, this is what should have happened. The defense should have brought in someone to dispute the blood. It's just that simple.
Well, I very much think that Kel is right 100%. And it's not worth adding any more to that. I don't, because she said it all that needed to be said on that subject. But I would add again, I think it was the last episode or maybe the one before it. You have to be careful when an expert says this is consistent with, and not interpret that as this is the only way that this could have happened, or this is some type of fingerprint, or this is definitive, right? When you listen to Kathleen Zellner's expert, he is making definitive statements. He's saying there's going to be a horizontal component of the velocity of that blood that's flinging it through the air that's going to give those stains a horizontal aspect, and that's what he's pointing to in that. And he's saying that definitively, and compare that to the state's crony, who's saying, oh yeah, that this is consistent with somebody being flung in. That language is not definitive. So you have to be very, very careful when you listen to them, because they talk as if they're saying something definitive, but in reality, the words that are coming out of their mouth are not definitive at all. And that's something that, and additionally, should have been pointed out to the jury.
100%, Big Jeff. And you could tell Storky was very nervous and very hesitant of what he was actually trying to allude to. But you could imagine the scenario whereby if I was presenting this in the trial, I would have done a simple experiment. I would have got a big white sheet of paper, 2 of them, put them on an easel, grab a brush, a painting brush, dip it into some fake blood and flick it across. In other words, flick the blood across in the direction that Teresa Horbach would have been flung into the car. And you would have immediately have seen on that piece of paper the trail of blood pointing in the direction of where you flung the paintbrush, right? Then you do the same experiment on the other side, dip it in the fake blood and flick it 90 degrees straight to the paper, and you watch the blood drip straight down, which means that you have elegantly proved in 1 minute that the state's case of what their blood experts said occurred was 100% bullshit, which means that Teresa Horbach wasn't picked up by Brendan and Stephen and flung into the back of her own RAV, causing the blood dripping pattern. It was caused by something else. And I'm sure Jack will lead us into the next bit, right, Jack?
Well, Doc, I was thinking about what you're saying about doing this, presenting this in court. I can hear Kratz and Fallon gone, Judge Willis, this is just going to confuse the jury. It's irrelevant. I can hear it now. literally in my mind. I know they didn't say that, but I know they would have done. They would.
Like dropping
They
a
would
key,
have.
for example.
Exactly. But we don't want to confuse the jury. Let's get them out of here. We want to do. If you want, I want the jury excused because this is too much. This is way too much. But yeah, that would have been a great experiment to show. Again, this goes again to deconstructing mechanically. How did this work? How does Kratz expect? How did Kratz expect the jury to follow along with his narrative? He sold them on it clearly. I mean, because the way that they went. But I think that well, there's more to it. We can't state it all just in this little short bit here because we're taking little snapshots of time. But looking at how he did what he did, yeah, that would have been a fantastic experiment. And it was a huge, as you said, Doc, it was a hugely missed opportunity.
Yes. Yeah, the important thing here, guys, is that you can't beat physics. You cannot beat the laws of physics, right? So if you got blood flying through the air and then hitting a surface that's perpendicular, and that back door was obviously swung open at 90 degrees, right? And you could tell that by the droplets of the blood. What is amazing is that Storky never talked about the blood dripping pattern, which is crucial. And you can see here, Kathleen Zellner's expert, Stuart James, elegantly, all he did was turn his laptop screen at 90 degrees to show that's the way the blood pattern would have looked. That's not what you see on the door. It's dripping straight down. And that's not confusing the jury. That's clarifying a crucial point.
Well, the only point that I'd like to make about this is that there's a show that was mega popular worldwide called Mythbusters. I'm sure most of you have heard of it by now. If not, you should look on YouTube and you'll get lost for days. And in the show Mythbusters, what they do is they try to bust a myth. They try to explain scientifically either this is possible or it isn't possible. And the key difference, what Mythbusters always do at the end of the episode, is if they can't replicate the results in the described manner, and in here our described manner is how a body was flung into the back of the RAV. And as Kathleen Zellner is showing, we can't get the blood to look like that, right? It won't do that. So they have to take the next step, and that is to, and this is what I wish they would have done, and that is to do whatever it takes to replicate the results and to show us not just turn the iPad, but actually have someone redemonstrate it. And that's what we get to see in a little bit, is they attempt to do that, and I think it's really powerful.
Yep, it really is powerful. And if I could just very, very quickly, I know it's not 100% relevant, but Jack will back me up. In 1985, when Stephen was convicted for the sexual assault of Penny Bernstein, do you remember what Dennis Vogel made Penny Bernstein do in court? Right? She got her husband to get up in front of the judge and the jury and reproduce what the attacker did to her in court. And I'm telling you right now, there would have been gasps of horror emanating in that courtroom. So by a simple demonstration, it goes to show the powerful effect, right? What do you reckon, Jack?
Absolutely. And can you imagine? I mean, just the little simple thing that Buting has suggested, about dropping the key. Can you imagine the impact of, again, this goes into mechanically how something works and how the story is presented, but in reality, the reality of how something really could have happened. Oh my God, Kratz would have probably stroked. I mean, right in the courtroom.
Correct. But this is a dirty game, guys. It's a dirty game. If the prosecuting team are using all these stalling tactics and blocking tactics, the defense has to pull out all stops. If I was Buting, I would have dropped the key. Okay,
Absolutely. Right then. So, oops,
Yep, and said, oops, it may not have been admissible, but the damage would have been done, right? The whole farce of Colburn rocking and rolling the cabinet and making the key come out of the back of the cabinet and around the corner, people would have immediately said, that's absolute garbage.
I mean, I want to
Absolutely.
see it. I want to see him reproduce that then, right? That's what I would have said. Anyway, we'll get to that.
I've got
I guess
something though.
Go ahead, Kel.
I just wanted to say, this isn't relevant to this case, but it's just, we're talking about juries and the impact and what experts and what demonstrations can do. The other day, Kaboom and I were, or a few of us, and Kaboom brought it to our attention, but he asked us the question and he said, what do you guys feel about jurors being able to do experiments themselves in the courtroom to understand the evidence? And we're like, oh, and we all kind of gave our feedback and said, why? And he goes, because there is a case that this has just happened. So there's a case that I'm not sure who knows about it. I only found out about it while Kaboom was telling us. It's about, I think it's Lisa Patterson and her husband, Scott. She was they were married. She went to work. He went out. He came home. They had like a home gym, and they found that the barbells, like the weight lift, was up against her throat, and it looked like she had suffocated and died from not being able to lift up the barbell, and she died. So he ended up getting charged and found guilty of her murder. When you read, like, I couldn't find too much on the case file, but I did do a little bit of research, and there was some circumstantial evidence that, that's what the case is basically built on, is circumstantial. There is a few inconsistencies with Scott's, events, like the timeline, his events, and he's accountable and all that. So there is a little bit of an iffy there. I can see it, but it was based on reasonable doubt. However, the jury, they brought in the bench and the barbell, and the jury were able to do experiments themselves by having to see, because the defense was trying to say that, the prosecution were able to say that if it had fallen on her while she was pressing lifts by herself, she would have been able to wiggle out of it. So the jury did it. They wanted to see whether or not you could wiggle your way out of it. And based on that, they found him guilty, because they thought, oh yeah, no, you would be able to get yourself out of that. Somebody held her down and did this. So I bring that up because this case, we have a jury that found him guilty because they were allowed to do an experiment for themselves to understand it. Yet overall, I said to Kaboom, take away that, do you think the jury got it right? And in fairness, with what you have, it's a reasonable doubt case. Like, it's very circumstantial. Do I think they could have found him guilty without having to do this experiment themselves? Yeah, absolutely. But I think that itself, that demonstration and that getting in there and understanding the crime scene, understanding the method of death, helped them understand that. And this is why I wish to God, like you guys just said, they just had dropped that key. They had just dropped that key, a simple experiment where the jury could have witnessed it. Don't ask, just do it. And even if it would have been like stripped and been like objection, the damage would have been already implanted in the jury. That's a funny thing it's not funny, but that's the weird thing about a trial when you watch people go, objection, I want that stricken from the record. You can stricken it all you want. I know in the court of law, you're not allowed to, when you go to deliberate, you're not allowed to take it in as a factor, but the damage is done. It plays on your mind. You've already seen it. You've already heard it. It's there. You can't take it away. You can't strip it from someone's mind. And although you can't use it as an overall reason, but it's there. And I think that sometimes that the juries do hang on to that. They just won't admit it. And it's only a natural instinct to do that. So I just wanted to bring that up because we're talking about, obviously, jurors the impact of experiments, the impact of evidence. So really quickly, what do you guys think of that? Do you think that if Kathleen was ever to ever have another retrial, and because we know she's done that experiment where she got Stephen to hold the key for 15 minutes, and then she ran it through, and she said the results were like 1/10 of what Sherry Colhane was able to produce. It was off the charts. Could you imagine if in a trial she did that with the jurors? She allowed all the jurors to hold an individual key. She's like, we're going to send this off overnight to an independent lab, and by tomorrow afternoon in closing, I'll give you the results. And then they could see how, like when the results came in, some of them wouldn't even probably leave DNA. There'd be no shedders, and some might have your normal levels, and then, you know what I mean? And then they can understand it. So what do you guys think of that? Do you think it's a dangerous game to play with jurors, or do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair, and it would have been spot on. And it's again, this goes back into directly what I was talking about, the mechanics of how something actually works, and that's perfect.
I agree 100%. I think the ability to try and reproduce a crime scene or how the crime has occurred in order to unpack it is crucial. And now that sort of begs the question, and I think I now know why, that the prosecuting team did not want the jury to go out to the salvage yard, walk around the place, go inside Stephen Avery's trailer and garage, just to see how absurd the entire scenario was, that Teresa Horbach was held up in this tiny, tiny bedroom, and there's not a forensic trace of her anywhere in that trailer, and also in the garage as well, because we know that the garage was full of stuff, right? It was completely jam-packed. You're not going to be able to stop and remove all forms of microspray of blood, right? And they luminoled the hell out of that garage. They never found her blood anywhere. They jackhammered the concrete. They still couldn't find any traces of her blood. So it's a real shame that the jury never went out there to the salvage site to visually see the state scenario and how ridiculous it was. And I agree, Kelly. I think the jury having the ability to do some experiments, simple ones, of course, is crucial.
You know, adding to that, and you mentioned it, Doc, just thinking about if Beauty and String had recreated, they had room there in the courtroom, recreated Avery's bedroom there in the middle and shown how, they wouldn't have had to put everything in there, but they could have put in some props in there and then crammed 3 guys in there just to show everyone how tiny that place was, and how this could have been missed.
Well, that experiment, but I'm a little dubious. I guess I'll have to walk on the other side. That you have to be very careful about what experimentation that you allow the jury to do, because it's going to be just as easy to come up with a false conclusion as a correct one, and it's not necessarily clear to me that it's going to end up favorable to the in every case to the correct side. So I agree with the sentiment that if it's something simple like sort of dropping a key to see whether it makes a noise, or even to see whether you can crawl out of it, whether it's feasible to crawl out of something, I think that's reasonable too. But it is a Pandora's box to some extent. They just have to be careful of in general.
I agree, Big Jeff, but it gives a scope. It gives a scope of possibilities. What is possible? What is impossible? And you're correct. Even though the jury will do experiments, none of that's going to be submissible, of course. But it's having a look at the forensic evidence and see if you can reasonably explain it away. And also to ask the question, are the conclusions correct or incorrect? And this was a very important stage of the murder investigation, right? Because the scenario here is that Teresa Horbach was shot at least twice in the skull. She obviously was profusely bleeding at that stage. Stephen and Brendan picked her up, flung her into the back of her own RAV4. The blood distribution pattern on that back door does not indicate that that occurred. That puts a big hole in the state's case.
I've had to side with you there, Big Jeff. I think it's a real sensitive issue. Just my own 2 cents on it. I think even in KZ's example, when she goes through to do these experiments, she's doing it with an expert on her, at her right hand. You know, people, not just laymen's, you know, not just a few people. And so as long as it's conducted by people who, one, have, you know, are impartial, right, and two, people who aren't just laymen and are going to be able to, you know, identify obvious mistakes in some sort of experiment, you know, and I just don't, yeah, I don't think that.
But
I already believe that jurors don't have enough training as it is to go into what they're already assigned to do. I believe there should be more juror training already, but I think that's a bigger discussion for later. But putting this other responsibility on their backs, I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's the good use of time, unless it's constructed by experts. That's my own personal opinion. You know, you guys are welcome to your own too.
But the flip side of that is that, are we expecting a jury, mainly composed of laypersons, to sit through 6 weeks of trial testimony with experts upon experts going through all the forensic evidence, and we are expecting the jury to fully understand the mechanics of all that forensic evidence, right? So the flip side is, you know, if you give them the chance to dabble and look for themselves, doing very simple things, I can see the advantages. Yes, there are disadvantages, but then again, you know, you're being judged by a 12-member panel jury, right? A lot of them don't have a scientific background, okay? So you're asking them to make big judgment calls on experts, right? So mainly, if an expert presents something, an opinion, because they're an expert, most of the jurors will tend to believe that expert. Yet, Kelly pointed out, in the Johnny Depp trial, you had 2 experts in the same field give total polar opposite answers and conclusions to the same issue. So it's a battle of the experts. Who do you believe? Who don't you believe? So it is incredibly complex and a big impasse on a jury.
Okay, so if I were looking here, I mean, I'm seeing stains with a tail on them, but you're saying
those are flow patterns. That's entirely different. If you have a stain of sufficient volume, gravity will overtake it and you will get a rundown, which we call a flow pattern.
Yeah, see, that's so huge though, because these stains just have a little flow pattern down, but they don't have any horizontal dimension to them.
Right. So there's no indication of horizontal motion.
Can you hand me your pen for a second? So I'm going to give you the cargo door again. Are you telling me these things would be sideways like that? Like, what would they look like if she's been thrown in the back?
You would see stains that would be more, they would show direction of travel as opposed to being near circular.
When Mr. Stalkey talked about the blood that was found in the back of the RAV4, where Mr. Stalkey told you the blood suggests impact, or what's called projected blood, as if an individual was thrown into the back of the SUV that was on the back gate that Mr. Stalkey talked about. We'll show you some pictures about that, as if the blood is splattering or is actually in movement as it hits the side of, or the back gate.
But Ken Kratz is actually making the same motion that Kathleen Zellner was just talking about what it should look like. And his hands are making this streaking motion right across the courtroom, streaking motion.
Which,
and then he goes, but that's not, that's how, so that's just what I picked up from that point, and that's why I stopped.
Yeah, Ken Kratz is arguing that the blood was projected the same way sort of a spitball would hit the wall. You kind of put the thing in the thing and shoot it out your pen, and like you did in grade school, right? And in that case, it would kind of go straight, hit the wall, and kind of splat against it. But that's the velocity at which she would have been hurled wouldn't have been anywhere near the velocity that a spitball would come out, for example, and that's just not the. I mean, his physics are so off. It's sad, and it's too bad that there wasn't anybody to pick up on that, because that was it's contrasted how sad and silly he sounds after just hearing Zona's expert.
Correct, 100% correct. And you see, in effect, this would have been the time where Strang and Buting could have done that little experiment with the paintbrush. So essentially, Ken Kratz debunked himself, and nothing would have been more powerful to have done that little experiment with the fake blood on a white sheet of paper, totally debunking the state's theory. That would have been very, very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think this has been a powerful episode. And unfortunately, this is where we have to wrap up for today. And, as Big Jeff always says, on to the next. So we will be on to the next week. But for right now, I will hand it over to Big Jeff for the top of the morning to your wrap-up comments.
Well, it was a powerful episode. And it is very interesting as we move through this episode and begin to interact with Kathleen Zellner, just to listen to her ooze sort of intellect and confidence and correctness, right? I mean, she's certain of that the things that she is seeing is a load of crap. This is not her first rodeo by any means, and it kind of refreshes you to sort of see the zeal in which she's pursuing this case, and sort of gathering up her own team of experts to absolutely debunk everything that's been put forward by the state. And it's frankly it's the reason why there's that many of us are truthers. And but many of us were truthers before MAM 2. Don't get me wrong, but Kathleen Zellner comes in and she really puts an exclamation point on all our beliefs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Big Jeff. And Dr. Silkman, if you wouldn't go ahead with your wrap-up.
Yeah, I mean, this is an incredible episode. This is what gets me excited very much about MAM 2, and that's looking at the forensic evidence and the way Kathleen Zellner did the right thing to try and reproduce the crime scene. She did this by purchasing a RAV4 and also hiring world-renowned experts to try and reproduce the crime scene. And she was able to elegantly demonstrate one of the main catch cries of the state was incorrect, that Teresa Halbach did not leave her blood on the back door by being flung into the back of her own RAV. That's huge. That totally changes the dynamics of what occurred to Teresa.
Again, a powerful part of the episode. Like Silkman, this is my favorite bit, just to be able to explore Kathleen and her experts and the experiments that she was able to do. Yeah, on to the next.
On to the next. Yeah, that becomes one of my mottos, I think, in life now too, thanks to Big Jeff. Jack, give us your countdown to the next episode. How do you? Thanks, Big Jeff. If you would.
Yeah, it's Big Jeff always talks about the reasonable man, the reasonable person, and looking at Kathleen just deconstructing how this actually happened, not what Kratz and Gahn and Fallon said happened. And it's completely different. We can apply this same formula to many, and we have many sections of this entire scenario case. So Yeah, I really enjoy going through this and breaking it down and understanding what a bullshit story that the state put forth. It's completely ludicrous. And on to the next.
Absolutely. And so for all of us here at Discussing a Murder, we'll be on to the next. And we hope you guys are on to the next with us next week, Monday, when we premiere. And until then, thank you to everybody in the chat. For Big Jeff, Dr. Silkman, Cal, and Jack, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.